It's the Bird Emergency. I'm Grant Williams. This is the Bird Emergency. I'm joined by Chad Crittle tonight, and Chad is the senior keeper, birds and free flight at the Adelaide Zoo, which is part of Zoos SA, which we'll talk about in a moment. And Chad's got the guiding hand over most of the bird stuff that's happening over there, especially the captive breeding programs, of which we're all very interested in: the Orange-bellied Parrot, Regent Honeyeater, and a bunch more. We'll get to all of that. Hi, Chad. Thanks for joining us.
No worries at all. Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate the chance to get together and chat all things feathered, being a passionate bird nerd myself since I can remember. So it's always good to shoot the breeze with fellow bird lovers.
Well, let's start there. I was reading that your career as a zookeeper sort of began in 2009, I think it was, but you preceded that for volunteering for about 6 years at the Free Flight show at Taronga. So tell us, are you a Sydney kid, and when did the bird bug get you? Let's find out how you became a birdman.
I am a Sydney kid. You've caught me out. I'm an East Coaster, although now I've translocated to South Australia, which I love. But I grew up on the northern beaches of Sydney, and my family's all still there. I have a great fondness for the place. But yeah, like most kids growing up in suburban Australia, particularly around a big city, you've got certainly a limit on the wildlife that you see around you. There's blue-tongued lizards in most of our back gardens, and there certainly was where I was growing up. But the one thing that you see all around you is birds. It's one of the great things about birds is that you do see them around our city areas. And so they were always around, and I liked them and was interested in them. But the Free Flight show at Taronga opened in 1997. And so I was 7 years old when it opened, and so I went along with my family and watched this show. And we'd always go to the zoo and we'd watch the seal shows or whatever was going on. But watch this bird show, and I remember there was a moment in the show where it was a blue and gold macaw at the time who just flew in out of nowhere, or it seems to be nowhere. Yeah. Exactly. Came down out of the sky like it appeared, landed on this person's hand, and it just blew my mind as a 7-year-old. It just, yeah.
I reckon, Chad, I've obviously got a few summers on you, but I went to the Free Flight show at Taronga in, I'm thinking 98 or 99, and it must have been the same bird, I reckon, that I was struck by the size. The size of the macaw. I think that was the first one I'd seen close. Obviously seen them in zoos, but at the end of a long flight, Avery, and you just don't get that feeling of how large they are, how long the tail is.
Seeing them in action just puts them in a different light. And it would have been the same macaw. There was only ever one blue and gold macaw that appeared in the Taronga Free Flight, actually. And yeah, it got me hooked. So following on from that, my poor family had to sit through many a Chad's bird show at home with budgies or cockatiels or whatever I had at home at the time. And then when I was 13, so I was a theatre kid. I loved performing and did drama. And
have we seen you on TV at the school spectacular? Because we used to get that once a year. That would be on telly in Melbourne. And the Eisteddfod, that was a Sydney thing as well. So were you in those things as well as being a bird nerd with your cockatiels? And you must have had bird parrots too, did you?
I never had a Burke's parrot, you know what? And I love them. They are one of my favourite species, but I've never had one. I didn't appear in Eisteddfod or in those ones, but I did appear on television. So I don't know if you remember Comedy Inc., which was a skit show on Channel 9. Yes.
Didn't last too long, but I do remember that one.
No, yes, well, I was on...
Just forgive me, I'm just seeing whether Burke's parrot is still acceptable or whether we have to call it something else nowadays, because I'm old. And,
no, Burke's parrot is still my understanding of it. But yeah, I appeared on Comedy Inc., and I did a bunch of TV commercials, and I did some professional theatre work when I was a kid. So I appeared in a professional production of Wizard of Oz, and I was in a professional production of Oliver. But when that all wrapped up, when I was about 13, and I wanted to keep practicing presentations, and so they started this youth volunteer program. And so I joined up when I was 13 and spent every weekend, school holidays at the zoo until I graduated school, and then straight out of school was lucky enough to get casual work as a zookeeper. So it started what's been so far a lifelong adventure and obsession with birds, but also the work that we do with them.
So apart from the hands-on work, working with the shows, and we'll talk about that's been extensive over your career, have you gone and done a science or ecology or something as well as your father always wanted you to go and get a qualification in case this bird stuff doesn't work out, son? Did you ever get that talk?
I certainly didn't. I was very lucky. I had parents who basically said, you figure out what you want to do and you find the path, which was very lovely of them. I did start a degree. So I started a biodiversity conservation degree at Macquarie in Sydney, which I still could probably go back and finish. But I did a year of it. And then during that time, I was working pretty regularly at the zoo, and that it became pretty clear that was my area of passion and focus, and the opportunity came. Yeah, and the opportunity came to do it permanently, and so I took that opportunity. Following on from that, I've done it. So the standard qualification for a zoo professional in Australia is a Certificate 3 from TAFE, which I've completed, and then it's just gone from there. Certainly, we work in partnership with we've got ecologists on the books at Zoos SA and so on, but for the work that I do, and for certainly the career path I ended up being attracted to, it wasn't needed for me at that point. So I took the work and decided to go down that path. But no door is ever closed. I would never be opposed to going back or looking into it if the passion and the drive drove me that way. But at the moment, that hasn't popped up. But yeah, it was certainly the trajectory I started down, and the role of the academic and so on didn't quite jump out to me at the time. And so here I am.
I think people would probably be surprised at the amount of presentations, so I'll call them that, the shows, but interactions with the public and demonstrating what you can communicate about conservation and about science by entertaining people with birds. That's probably not the complete way to frame it, but you've done over 3,500 of these things, and not only in Australia. So I didn't know that there was such a demand for them. How important are they let's look at Adelaide, in the operation of Adelaide Zoo?
Well, the free flight bird show is one of the key draw cards and programs, certainly from a visitor interaction perspective, that we run at Adelaide. It's the large-scale animal shows or any form of interaction with public from a staff member at a zoo, the more and more that we understand of, and the more and more work that gets published on it, is the real way that us as organisations make a difference, particularly with people who are sitting on the fence about conservation. It's certainly, if you're an avid bird nerd already, or if you're an avid herp nerd, or whatever passionate area is, going to a zoo and seeing a keeper talking about orangutans and orangutan conservation, for example, you don't need to be pushed over the fence. But the reality is there's millions of people visit a zoo in Australia every year. And around the world, it's an astronomical figure of people go through the gates of accredited zoos.
Can you give us an idea of what the visitor numbers are for Adelaide?
Yeah, we sit at about, obviously the last 2 years has been very different. Yeah, but an average year prior to that would be about 500,000 people would go through the gates, which for a small city that's for Adelaide.
Is that Adelaide only, or does that include Monarto? Because let's introduce Monarto and the Zoos SA setup while we're having this little chat too.
So I would say, actually, it would be the two combined from the last year that we got that figure. And so Zoo South Australia it's a not-for-profit charitable organisation. So we're non-government and we're owned by our membership. So if you're a zoo member to our two properties, you can vote at the AGM and so on. But we operate the two sites. So we operate Adelaide Zoo, which is in the centre of Adelaide, basically. For those of you who haven't visited, it's right next to the Botanic Gardens. It's one of the, if not the smallest major city zoo in Australia in terms of land size, but it's the second oldest. So it's the second oldest behind Melbourne and has been in operation for over 130 years. And then Monarto opened its doors in the 90s, and it's out near a town called Murray Bridge, which is a satellite city. And Monarto started as basically an overflow for large hoof stock, and then
and that was a private concern, wasn't it? And then they hit hard times. Is that the story right, or was that a different one?
That was a different park. So Monarto was actually originally purchased by the Don Dunstan government, whichever one Don Dunstan was a part of, and
he was
Minister for the Arts, I believe.
Well, he's famous for his pink safari, but that was Labor government. I think that in the mid-70s, I think it began. I think Don Dunstan was a premier when I was in late primary school, may have even been earlier. But, yeah, Don Dunstan was very much – he was the groovy politician when I was a kid. The pink safari suit was all the go. And, yeah, South Australia – Adelaide became the city of the arts basically because of Don Dunstan, I think so.
Well, his legacy in that space is undeniable for our city, but they purchased that land originally it was going to be a satellite city development. So it was going to be building suburbia basically. And when that didn't happen, the Department of Environment had a setup there, which was basically a setup of aviaries for confiscated animals and things like that. And it was quarantined for a bit too. Yeah. And then it was gifted to the Zoo Society basically as overflow. And then Monarto Safari Park opened its doors in the 90s as Monarto Zoo and has slowly grown over the years and it is currently the largest zoo property on the planet. So in terms of actual land size of the property, it is the biggest in the world. So you can fit every major zoo in Australia into Monarto and have space left over. It's enormous. And a lot of that...
Sorry, Chad, it would be a logical sort of partner to what Dubbo has been doing because they're similar kinds of locations in that they're a long way from major cities and that they are dry land, sort of rangeland properties. So obviously for large mammals, they're really good. What's the focus of Monarto in the Zoo's SA setup?
So certainly the approach that to most visitors is Monarto is geared as like a safari. So you go to Monarto, you ride the bus, and it's more of a day-out safari adventure where you're looking at animals in large range habitats. Certainly, though, one of the benefits of Monarto, though, is the amount of space we have, is what we can do behind the scenes. So certainly from an organisational perspective, there's a lot of programs that occur up there behind the scenes where we've got the space to isolate things. So, for example, our contribution to the Plains Wanderer breeding program, it takes place up there. Our contribution so we were one of the major partners in the Malleefowl wren translocations that occurred back into South Australia, and we did all the analogous work on capture and restraint and transport.
Can I just butt in there? Was that the project that Simon Verdon was doing?
Yes. So working to move.
We've done an episode with Simon. So and that was a learning experience, I think, that one.
For sure. And certainly from our perspective, what we did originally was we did work with rufous-crowned wrens as an analogous species to basically figure out all our capture and restraint, transport, handling, and so on. But then also following on from that, it's been captive breeding trials with that species to get all of our techniques down pat so that when Malleefowl wrens come in, as a key part of the program too, which was part of the partnership, that we've done all the husbandry techniques with a more common analogous species that enabled us to deliver on goals better with the Malleefowl wrens.
So in your collection, you've got over 1,000 birds, but you're breeding over 100 species. Is that no? You're keeping 100 species. Sorry.
Yeah.
So how many of those 100 are you breeding? And then, and you've just mentioned that you're preparing for Malleefowl wrens and whatnot. I'd be really interested to know, what are the Australian birds that you are currently breeding with a view to have be part of insurance stock with the Australian Zoos network? So
certainly, within Australia, we've got an organisation called the Zoo and Aquarium Association, and they're an accrediting body as well as a facilitator of our managed breeding programs across the country. So they administer, for example, the Orange-bellied Parrot breeding program, which we're a part of, and then there are a multitude of other species that they work with across the board. With birds, we're a part of 11 out of the 15 programs, so that includes castle little penguins, Orange-bellied Parrots, Regent Honeyeaters, rose-crowned fruit doves, black-winged stilts, white-browed wood swallows, and
Swifties?
So Swifties, interestingly, Swifties are currently in the process of being upgraded to a managed breeding program, but they have not been for the last decade. But we've been working in the Swift parrot space for the last 10 years. So there are a number of species, for example, that aren't managed that we still actively are involved with from a conservation standpoint.
That's really the question, because the managed programs get their a comms team behind them, right? And then so the publicity goes out about what's happening. I'm really interested in those birds that not at that stage yet. I saw in the material that you gave me there was a focus on palm cockatoos. There's eastern bristlebirds there's been a focus on trying to breed them. So what are you trying to get going? Because it's all a matter of, you're coming from a background that I had as a kid too. Aviculture, you get some birds and then you try and breed them. You try and give them the environment for them to breed. It's not much different, too simple, but whether it's a canary, a budgie, a zebrafinch or an eastern bristlebird, the challenges are the same. You've got to give them what they need and make them comfortable enough to do what comes naturally. So apart from those icon species that we know about, Malleefowl, I saw some information about Malleefowl. What is there a long list? Is it a long shopping list?
So we've got, out of those 100 species which we house, every single one of those species, is according to our species plan, has to serve a purpose of some sort.
In captivity.
To be there. Because one of the big things about a modern zoo is we don't want to just have things for the sake of having them. It's not about having the biggest and best showing of birds for everyone to come and look at. Everything's certainly got to have a reason. And certainly one of the biggest challenges we face as a private charitable organisation is resources, and trying to resource these programs where it's not just birds, it's also reptiles and mammals and a whole range of tack. So we've got to be very selective about what we have, why we have it. And that role can be an advocacy role. It can simply be that having that animal in a really nice setup tells a really important story to our visitor about a habitat. And so, for example, Malleefowl on site at Adelaide Zoo tell the story of the Mallee habitat. Malleefowl on site at Monarto were off exhibit breeding, and so they serve a different role. But also our Malleefowl at Adelaide for a very long time had a live camera set up above their nesting mound, which was a partnership we had with the recovery team, so that people could see an active nest live. And so there's a huge variety of ways that these animals serve a purpose. But in terms of like the species that are up and coming, certainly, so swift parrots is a big one. Swift parrots are, as we know, they're critically endangered. They need all the help that they can get. And so certainly one of the biggest benefits of the Orange-bellied Parrot program has been that now with the relationships we've got in that network, it's been acknowledged that we don't want to get to the point we got to with orange-bellied parrots before we set up an active insurance population in that space. And so working with our partners with that species is in the process of being upgraded to a managed species. But before that occurred, we've been supporting research in that space. So we've long had a very large group of swift parrots at Adelaide Zoo. And so we've worked with researchers from A&U's difficult bird research, and they've come in and done...
With the good Dr. Swift Parrot, no doubt.
Yes. They've come in and done tracker trials on our birds. So basically wearing the satellite trackers in a controlled environment so that they can test how it affects an animal's ability to deal with its environment so that they can feel comfortable to put it on an animal in the wild. We're about to do the same thing with regent parrots. It's something that we've done before with regent parrots, but we're about to do it again. The same with black-winged stilts. So our black-winged stilts served exactly the same purpose on a banded stilt trial. So they were using our black-winged stilts to test the tracking equipment on banded stilts. And then palm cockatoos is another great one. They're a species that we've housed at Adelaide since the early 1900s. But since the 1990s, we've been the only place in the country where you could see palm cockatoos in Australia in a care setting. And we've had the only chicks hatched in human care in the country since the 70s at Adelaide. And so, again, a lot of people would question then, what's the purpose? Why have you've only got, and the reality is at the moment there's less than 10 in human care in the country. If you have numbers like that, what's the point? And from our perspective, with those animals, we've been able to document husbandry techniques, refine incubation techniques, refine rearing techniques, refine double clutching, refine nutrition, so that if, now that they've been upgraded to an endangered species, if it's ever required, we've got all the information ready to go. So we don't have to test techniques, brand new founder birds that are a key part of an insurance population. I'm not saying that at the point that's our intention. We've just got it there should we ever need it. And again, then supporting research. So we supported a facial recognition software trial with palm cockatoos that enabled them to identify individuals in the wild just through photographs rather than catching and tagging. And so we were able to do that with our birds as a control, as well as cognition. So there's a lot of varying prongs to how an animal in our care kind of helps. And I certainly take your point about, certainly it's similar in essence to caring for animals in human care is the same whether you're a zoo or whether you're a person at home with a finch ovary. But certainly some of the species we're working with are species which facing challenges in the wild because specialised in a certain area or they require a certain food or weather pattern. And so having them in our care where we're able to pool our resources as a region, work with universities, academics to really nut this stuff out, it gives us the best chance to succeed long-term with conservation goals, which is the goal at the end of the day. Speaking for myself personally, I would dream of the day, and so I'm saying this as well, this is a personal opinion, I would dream of the day where a zoo didn't have to exist. And the reality, unfortunately, is that I can't see that world currently, certainly for a long time into the future. And so
every one of your programs a runaway success. Unless we're going to give the world back to the wild environment, that world's never going to exist again, because people know now through mass media and mass communications, they know about all the animals, the birds, the plants, the fish that are in the world. They can't possibly go and see them all, but they still want to see them. So there's always a demand for a zoo as a collection, as a sightseeing opportunity. And the best outcome is to marry that with all of the research and opportunities and the demand that is, because you can do a lot of study in a non-invasive way in a zoo that you can't do in the wild, that you can pick up the same kind of information for things like blood typing and all that kind of stuff. It's easier to do that with birds that are used to being handled than trapping birds that haven't been handled, or fish.
It's certainly true. Yeah. I think where it would change, and this is like even what we've seen in zoos around the world in terms of good accredited zoos over the last 2 decades. What they're keeping and what we're showing to the public has shifted. Yep. So even though there's certainly a demand there for people who want to get out and see wildlife, would we ever see a world where the Adelaide City site, for example, ever had an elephant again?
No. And that's where zoos have really come a long way, in that they have taken, each one has taken a direction with a specialty, and they've really improved their knowledge and their capability to display. And you would think that with the appropriate displays, that's reducing stress levels on the animals nowadays. So zoos have really come a long way from when I was a kid, and there are a handful of elephants in a tiny little enclosure at Melbourne, and I remember seeing the old enclosure at Taronga, it must have been hell before they upgraded that. Chad, I just want to take the opportunity to say thank you, Dr. Nick, for the thumbs up. Those of you who are in the Peanut Gallery, and there are some of you, feel free to leave a comment, suggest a question, anything that I'm not covering, because no doubt there'll be a lot that I don't cover, because we're definitely having a bit more fun than normal tonight. Chad, you're a herper as well. So let's talk a bit about the Western Swamp Tortoise and that captive breeding program that you were involved in. I know nothing about it, so fill me in.
So Western Swamp Tortoises are a pretty amazing species. They were at one point, the most endangered species of reptile in the country. So that title has since been pipped and has now gone to another species of turtle in New South Wales, another particular river specialist. But in terms of the Western Swamp Tortoise, so it's a program that Perth Zoo spearhead, and we're lucky enough to work with them on. But as a species, they're interesting in a multitude of ways. They're a summer estivator. So their estivation occurs through the summer months rather than the winter months, unlike most species of freshwater turtle in our country.
Now, just pretend I don't know what estivator is.
So an estivation is basically a form of hibernation or torpor. Okay. It's just another term for it, and they do that through the summer months in leaf litter rather than in winter. But for them, it's about rainfall. So where they live in these seasonal ephemeral wetlands that were around area, and so winter is when they're full of water and so therefore food. So that's when they're active, and then they actually rest in the summer months. Now, they're interesting because of that. They're interesting, though, then because how much their habitat has changed because of development and also rainfall patterns.
Has that been the main cause of their decline? That the land use changes?
It's partly that. But it's also because where they live, they didn't have any natural predators. So their response to something different is, oh, what's that? And they'll just literally swim towards it. And so a fox or a pig or a cat just sits there, and it's Uber Eats for them. But for them, that's been that in partnership with habitat change or loss has been the biggest issue. But with Western Swamp Tortoises, thankfully, that program in terms of breeding and releasing has been very successful over the last 5 to 10 years, and has got a self-sustaining increasing wild population in partnership with a self-sustaining increasing population in human care. And so the biggest issue now is just managing the habitat and making sure that the habitat's going to be there and continue to be there long term. And as rainfall patterns shift and change, that's going to be something that we're going to have to deal with a lot of habitats. But as a species, they're certainly from a population level going in the right direction. So our involvement in Adelaide is purely we housing, breeding them, and then animals that we breed travel back to Perth after 2 estivation cycles in Adelaide, and then they get released back to the wild over in Perth. One of the reasons we do that, because a lot of people would ask, for example, like if Perth are doing it, why would Adelaide do it? One of the reasons that we like to do that is because when caring for animals in human care, you can't, if your whole population is centralised in one location, like in one captive facility, you have to view it in the same way that if you had one pocket of wild habitat in the wild, and if something happens to that pocket, so say there's a horrific fire or a natural disaster or even a potential disease outbreak that's not familiar with, if everything's in the one spot, don't have a true insurance population. And so having your population spread out is important.
Because we can talk about noisy scrub birds and western ground parrots and Malleefowl wrens to be thinking about that. Malleefowl wrens obviously aren't that as limited, but those threats are real nowadays. So
they certainly are, and as habitat becomes more fragmented, it's going to be an issue that we face more and more in the coming 20 to 30 years. And the good thing is that we're getting far better in this country in general and as an industry, in terms of the zoo industry, at acting proactively on those concerns to prepare rather than reacting to a crisis that's already occurred. So I think it's looking better in that sense, but it's still a long way to go.
Chad, while we were talking and you're talking about managing habitat and whatnot there, something just came to mind, and this is, again, a bit of not an in-joke, but an in thing. Today I released an episode for the podcast which featured Sally Bryant, who is the chair of the 40-spot Adelaide recovery team, and they're in the process of updating a recovery plan which was last produced in 2009. Now, you in 2021 were the chair of the OBP recovery team. Now, after I put Sally's episode out, I got a comment on YouTube, and I've just brought it up. I'm going to put it up and read it out. And I responded straight away to it with some comments. I want to kick this around with you because this, I think, goes to a bit of a preconception. And before we turned the recording on, I was talking about, I'd always assumed that nearly all the captive breeding was funded mostly by government in some way, the departments. But you said that Zoos SA is a totally non-government, non-profit. So I'm going to ask you later how much government money goes in. But let's get this up and see if we can read it. So Chris has said, as a response to what Sally and I talked about, so many of these threatened species recoveries teams are failing to do their job. The survival of these species is their responsibility. The last 40-spot Adelaide recovery plan was expired in 2010. What have they been doing for the last 10 years? What have I said? I think they would universally say it's pretty hard to do much without funding. I know the 40-spot team are in the process of renewing the plan now. You can't really update a recovery plan if there's no money for monitoring or new surveys. Hopefully the next decade will not be a disaster. The last one was. I'll eagerly await the updating, and I think I just said let's hope for the best. Now, you've sat in the chair for a recovery team, and that team that you were the head of for that period is one of the icon species, one of the glamour species. Everyone wants to talk about the orange-bellied parrot. But do you think the criticism is fair? Like, I took umbrage to Chris saying that it was their responsibility. The recovery teams are just a bunch of scientists and conservationists. The responsibility, in my view, is the government's, because either the First Nations people own the wildlife or the government owns the wildlife, right? So
I think the responsibility of a recovery team is an interesting one. Each recovery team...
It's a vexed issue, isn't it? But the view in the public, which is what I was interested in, is that I don't know where we got it wrong with the whole threatened species recovery hub and the commissioner and the whole thing, that people who are obviously well-meaning and care would then be blaming people like you and Sally for what is going wrong, which is totally off track, in my view.
I think the reality of recovery teams is it's like saying, look, they're broad. And the reality of recovery teams in Australia is there's no actual... So you can be an accredited or an approved recovery team by the federal department. But anyone, if they really wanted to, could put a bunch of stakeholders together into a room and start calling themselves a recovery team.
Because whoever got the money... Whoever was able to raise the money would be able to say, we are the team, aren't we? Because they would be doing the work.
Certainly. But there is actually a process,
yeah.
A process to be officially endorsed. Yeah.
I understand that. But what I just want to ask you this, I'll put you on the spot here. If you're the chair of the recovery team for the yellow-bellied, sap-sucking, pigeon-legged parrot, right, the chances are that your job is a lecturer in ecology or that you are the manager of X program in X government department and that you do the recovery team work for nothing. That the position might get you a seat, but you're not paid on the recovery team to run the recovery team, are you?
Certainly not. So in terms of those roles are the organisations who decide they're a stakeholder and have a chair on the team, basically donate some of their resource to the recovery team.
To put someone on the team. So
certainly.
That's where the communications have got wrong, haven't they?
Certainly. And I think basically, to me, a recovery team is the way I look at a recovery team is a central location of stakeholders or people who've got a knowledge in the space.
Yep, special skills.
Exactly. To at least have a focal point or at least some get-together of those minds on a regular basis to talk about the issues facing a species. Are they all funded?
No.
Do they all have access to the same amount of money? No. Is it dependent on... It's dependent on grants. It's dependent on... So, for example, the Orange-bellied Parrot recovery team has a small amount of money that is allocated to a part-time coordinator role, which basically helps us administer the program. So that program, being a big glamour species, as you refer to it, requires a lot of reporting to lots of different bodies, and there's a lot of working groups within the recovery team. And so, for example, myself, when I was chairing, so I was in an interim position for just almost 12 months between an official chair being elected. So generally, the chair position is actually held by someone from a government department. And at the time, the previous person had gone past their tenure in the role and there wasn't anyone else able to, at that point, step into the role. And my organisation was happy to support it. So we did it for 12 months. But at that point, I was wearing the hat as a recovery team chair, which also then you chair the species SACG, which is a smaller group of specific knowledge sets in the recovery team, which meet more regularly. The Species Advisory Program Group or something, I forget the P, but it's basically the recovery team votes on key, big, broader things, and then the SACG has got the key academics, the key government department representatives, and then the chairs of the other subgroups, which are the captive management group, which is the group within the recovery team of all of the organisations that keep orange-bellied parrots in care and breed them, but also anyone in relation to genetic work that's managing the program. Then there's also a veterinary technical reference group, which manage wildlife concerns in care and in the wild. And then there's other working groups.
And does that group, the vet group, do the genetic work as well?
No, so that generally occurs under the captive management group.
Okay.
So in that field, those groups of roles, one time as chair of the recovery team, I was sitting on all four of those groups. So you're meeting pretty regularly with people and you're writing reports and you're writing articles and you're writing minutes, and the realities of being a chair of a group like that is mostly writing minutes and checking in on actions, plus my other hats that I wear in other zoo organisation bodies, and then my day-to-day role at supervising a team of people and on the ground with birds. All of this is done generally out of people's sincere passion and goodwill for these species. Yeah. And that includes, I will say, the people who work for the government departments involved in this.
Oh, absolutely. They're doing extra hours to get this work done because they're still putting signs up at the national park or wherever it is that they're also working. They're still cleaning the toilets and all that stuff in their normal job. My view on threatened species and whose responsibility it is that, to me, it's everybody's responsibility. It's the community's responsibility. It's the community's responsibility. It's the government's responsibility. It's business. It's individual stakeholders. It's everybody.
And the reality is, when you look at successful programs, or what you would mark as a successful program, is when everybody involved has really owned. So I look, for example, at Regent Honeyeaters. To me, I know their population is still not where we'd like it to be, but you look at the ownership that the local communities in that area have over that program, the people, the school kids who really love that program and own Regent Honeyeaters as their bird, and they champion it. It's become then an election issue in their area. So then your politicians become aware of it. It becomes, that's what it's all pervasive.
Needs to be. Yeah. It needs to be that on a local level. Regents is really interesting. Now, tell me, is Monarto situated in Regent Honeyeater habitat? Is it suitable? Historically.
And then into the Adelaide Hills they were found too. They were found all the way down into the Adelaide Hills.
And so I said this to you earlier on before we pressed the button, and I guess regular listeners will have heard me bleating on about this kind of stuff all the time. My concern with Regent Honeyeaters, and I think they're the really absolutely dead set urgent Australian one at the moment, is in South Australia, are they still allowing suitable habitat for Regent Honeyeaters, whether it's private land or public land, to be cleared? Do you know
that? That I cannot answer. I don't know the answer to that question.
So this is where my really obvious problem as an outsider is. If we've got recovery teams that everybody is doing their best to keep these species viable, isn't the first thing that government of any colour, persuasion, or whatever, if they're serious, they've got to stop the habitat being knocked down? There's a lot of focus on koalas and habitat, but Regent Honeyeaters are the ones who are going to lose out first and biggest. And the idea that we might still have two tractors and a chain knocking down habitat for one of the ones that is teetering on the brink to put wheat or soybeans or whatever in the ground, or to have cows poo on it, is just, to me, is insane. And the whole idea of directing money into these programs, shouldn't we be buying this sort of marginal farmland, marginal country can be returned to habitat if we had this coordination? So my frustration is, and I invite you to vent, why is it that we can get all of the stuff coordinated and all these bodies and all these funding groups and foundations and everyone all to get together on the hard stuff of understanding the creatures, breeding them, setting up the right environment in captivity, but we can't coordinate to stop the stuff happening? And I don't say that we have to tell farmers, we're going to take your livelihood off you, you can't do that. Why don't we just buy the bloody property, give them a return? Maybe we have to pay a premium to get it, but isn't it worth it? Why can't we coordinate that? There's my frustration, mate.
It's a very good question, and I think it should go hand in hand. The way we should view it, go hand in hand. Now, personally, for example, I don't sit on the Regent Honeyeater recovery team.
No. I know I'm taking you out of school, but the issue is there for all of these.
Certainly, I think where it fits into me is where it becomes you've got a resource base which is limited, and it is. Even if you had all the funding in the world, research and all of the above is very expensive. So, for example, like orange-bellied parrots, I would say at the moment, the funding that goes into the recovery team supports research and certainly the infrastructure for releases and so on. But at the moment, all the captive breeding work that goes on, testing in relation to that, transport cost, the vast majority of that occurs at the organisation's own expense. That doesn't even come out of recovery team funds. That most of the time. There are some examples where funding will be allocated in a grant for a specific project, but mostly we're doing that out of the general operations of Zoo South Australia, for example. Yeah. But if you've got a...
Sorry. I was just grinning because every time I speak to someone, the battle for funding is never ending. But then we've just given $40 billion away to companies that didn't need it. I think it was $15 billion that they've given away to schools that didn't need it. And we've spent, we don't even know how many billion on submarines that we're never going to get. But we can't find a couple of million,
Well,
So that's where
certainly,
it comes back to the community, doesn't it? We've got to force the issue.
certainly. I will say that the new fund that was opened up that was accessible to recovery teams, for example, and the species that made the 100 priority, the recent 100 priority listing, which has
every
been...
time I see that Channel 9 show where it goes the 100, I think.
The 100.
That's what I think of.
The listing. But that was certainly a welcome access to money that we've been able to get access to or apply for. I think resourcing is always going to be a tricky one. I think what it comes down to for me, though, is, for example, your biggest issue at the point that the program was established was just the population. It was baseline the population. Irrelevant of what was going on as to what was triggering it in the wild. We didn't even have enough in care that it mattered. You could have.
We got to the game too late. We were 15 years behind where we needed to get into it. No one thought it would get that bad, did it? Well, two things. No one thought it would get that bad. And two, there hadn't been enough money put into monitoring, because there's been guys like Ross and Dean who have and Chris and doing stuff off their own bat for 20 years because they're really keen bird watchers. That was the information we had. We didn't have people and teams out there scouting all over 3 and 4 states when it was needed. When I was in my 20s, that was when it was needed.
The reality is, though, is that when that becomes then your key issue, unfortunately, what that means is that gets all your resources. So therefore, if your bigger issue then becomes why is the species in reduction, which it always is going to be, then you're always going to be coming to that after addressing just the population level. So with any of the species where we've been able to get to it beforehand, the work can be done ahead of time. So I look at cassowaries, for example. Cassowaries, to me, is a really great example of work that was done through the recovery team and birds in human care under the guise of James Biggs, who's now the Director of Conservation at the Zoo and Aquarium Association. Wonderful guy. He was my manager when I worked at Cairns Tropical Zoo. And during that time, and I certainly won't speak for his work or take any credit for it, but the work that he did working with James Cook University on road fatalities and so on working with the community has led to all of those organisations getting successful corridors put in place, bridges built over highways. There is so much getting done in that space, which has meant that the sheer numbers on the ground is not the issue that we need to focus on necessarily. We're actually able to do that preventative work in terms of habitat protection. The key is where that focus needs to be. And if we get to the program where we just need bums on seats, it just by default means that your habitat base then is going to be reduced by the time you get there. So unfortunately, it's just how we deal with that.
And the Far North Queensland community have really adopted the needs of the cassowary, are now living around them rather than saying, right, this is how it is, cassowaries have to fit in.
Well, I look at the southeastern red-tailed black cockatoo. That's a project that we've been working on at Zoos SA. We've been working with the local community in that part of the world, providing expertise for surveying and funding for tree planting and so on. But the reality is that is a local community owning a project that has resulted in a successful turnaround of a species. Now, it's certainly not done. There's still a long way to go, but it's going in the right direction thanks to the ownership of a community. And again, it's become a political issue in that area. And through their work as a community, that species has got a future. We're able to work with that community on a species like that. But if you don't have good advocates for those species, and that's, again, I look at the recovery team a lot as that. Recovery teams need to be good advocates for species too. And that's where having good communications people. So it's a skill set that I think we need to address more broadly in the ecological community. Having people who are good at communications, good at marketing, good at this stuff, actually out there telling these stories as well, or talking about the good work that happens. It is important because we're in a very competitive market in terms of trying to get people's attention.
Yeah.
And when cost of living's going up and all of the above, if you say, well, actually, no, I need your support for this parrot that's the size of a budgie, you really have to have planted a seed to that person that they care about them for that to succeed.
Do you remember when Jeff Kennett called them the trumped-up Corella?
Yes.
That was that was when the wind farm issue was happening. So there's always pressures on. There's always going to be a commercial imperative for somebody, a commercial interest for somebody to ensure that we don't do anything, because there's always a resource that somebody wants to exploit that the bird or the turtle or the fish need. Mm-hmm. So that's always a battle that needs to be done. So there's 2 points I want to take up. The Malleefowl, I reckon, I haven't dug into it as much as I know, but but it seems to me that the recovery team and all of the community groups across 3, perhaps 4 states have really got coordinated now. And if climate change really affects the Malleefowl, I think we're ahead of the curve in terms of being proactive and ensuring a viable population for that bird. That's really encouraging that a lot of the lessons seem to have been learned and that the skills that people have learned in one area are now being transferred into other projects. So I get a really good feeling about that. We've just talked about cassowaries. It's not too long ago. I think about the time I registered the domain for the bird emergency was 2013, 2014. I'd actually resigned myself to the orange-bellied parrot being like the Norwegian blue. Ex-parrot. But the team down at Melaleuca and then everybody in all the other locations have done a smashing job. I mean, the fact that I'm pretty confident without any of the inside game, it looks like we might have turned the corner, and without a natural disaster afflicting the wild population now, it seems like you guys have all worked out how to do the introductions and to get that migration, that first migration, to be successful, and that those populations, provided we can keep the habitat for them, that they'll be viable going on into the future. So that's a win. Let's class that one as a win. What's your gut feeling about Swifties? Are they going to adapt to breeding in captivity?
Well, Swifties, unlike orange-bellied, Swifties have been kept in human care and in aviculture for many years. And so in terms of breeding Swifties in human care, it's not so much actually the issue, which in some ways is a good thing. I feel confident that when, as a program, it's established and we start needing to produce animals and managing animals, I don't see that being a concern, because certainly from our perspective, we've been breeding Swifties at Adelaide for 20, 30 years. Okay. They've been very actively kept in the private sector for a very long time. Yeah. So it's not so much with Swifties is breeding them in care, and I guess that's the good thing. It's Swifties, we can breed them. We know we can breed them.
And there's a good reservoir of genetics in the private collection so that you could swap individuals and all that to keep that. You're not going to be down to a couple of hundred distinct genetic identities. So
yeah, we're in a better position certainly with Swifties than we were with OBPs by the time the program started. I think the benefit of Swifties is we can learn the lessons from OBPs, what works, what doesn't, and basically be on the front foot with all that other habitat work that I was talking about in partnership with a captive breeding program that allows for building numbers and releasing to support it. And I guess that's the good thing about Swifties, is that we're in a better position. Are we in a good position? No, because at any point if you've got a critically endangered animal, you're not in a good position. Do I feel quietly confident about Swift parrots? I do. I feel like we're not coming to the party as late. In saying that, though, OBPs weren't in as a terrible position 30 years ago when a recovery team was formed originally.
No,
but that's also really because
that's 15 to 10 years ago time where so much of the breeding and how to release them hadn't really been solved. But that seems to have been done. So,
well, certainly we've had positive results, like seriously positive results the last 2 seasons in comparison to the previous decade. And for me, the fact that I used to stand up and do talks for volunteer groups and stakeholder groups, and I wasn't at the point where I was like, they're done, but I was saying at one point, we're not going to see an orange-bellied parrot in South Australia for decades, is what I was saying. And then last year, one popped up on the Coorong. Like, at that point, I was happy to eat my words because it was a really exciting moment. But it's then on us, and it is something that we take seriously. And the great thing about that program is the people involved are super passionate about the work.
That's where I wanted to go just for a minute too, is to talk about, or just to really recognise those people who have been long-serving participants at Malleefowl, talking people who have been doing work, some with a little bit of recompense, but basically people giving up their time for 30 years, 35 years, some people not as long, obviously, but that's committed. That's people really committed to the cause, and we've got to celebrate them. We've got to celebrate them.
It's a hard slog. I mean,
and they're the invisible people too, Chad. They're not on the recovery team, and their names aren't on any published articles and whatnot. But they're the ones schlepping around with buckets of feed and wiping down feed tables and wiping down aviaries and whatnot. So
certainly our work wouldn't be possible without volunteers and the people who do. I come and I get to talk to you, but even in my own organisation, I've got a whole team of people who are out there working with OBPs day to day. And again, like we do, it's by no small feat that these things happen. There are hundreds of people who work on this project. And the reality is that 3 years ago, and Adelaide Zoo is one of the smaller holders of the species, certainly in comparison to some of the bigger facilities. But we would still every year have more on site at Adelaide than were in the wild at the start of the breeding season. And to go from that to the levels that we're seeing now of population return, but also leaving in less than 5 years is very exciting. Are we out of the woods? Certainly not.
No.
Again, do I feel quietly optimistic? Yeah. And I think mainly because I feel like the team has really pinned down on the releases that are most effective, the techniques involved in that, but also the research that's gone into it, the work that the ANU Difficult Research Group has done with Difficult Bird Research Group has done in partnership with DPIPOI and, NRE in Tasmania now and DELP in Victoria, and then all the other organisations that have supplied data. That work is priceless, and it's helped us in our jobs constantly. So we're very lucky.
And so many of the lessons that have been learned with the OBP can now be applied to other species that require a number of states and a number of different NGOs as well as governments getting together and following a process. So it's a good news story for that. I just don't think people understand how much time is donated to the cause, because the Difficult Birds Group, they're all doing their other academic stuff. They're still publishing papers on everything else that they've got to keep doing to get other grants and to keep employed. And then they're doing all the recovery team work and feeding in information, doing surveys, checking nest boxes, picking off mites, all that. I just wish that's why I do the show, is so that the public can understand that it's not a bunch of people sitting in Spring Street or what's the relevant street in Adelaide where when you're talking about state politics, like in Sydney it's North Terrace. It's all those people in North Terrace stuffing it all up. It's just not like that. There's a pot of money, you all have to compete for it. It's never enough. Good projects. We
get it done, and
that's right. And you get it done off your own back.
Well, I've got to acknowledge, I've got to publicly acknowledge, for example, the work of Carolyn Hogg, who works out of Sydney, and the IVP program in human care, the work that we've been able to do on that population, where we've got such a robust population, where we can comfortably release 100 birds a year now, is all off the back of her work on understanding the genetics, how we could best manage it. She's been basically donating her time to help the species coordinator and stud bookkeepers as part of ZAF. And it's been amazing. Yeah.
For years.
And it's people like that who, even the roles of species coordinator and stud bookkeeper, Lisa Tuttle and Ash Herod over at Moonlit Sanctuary, again, they're voluntary positions that organisations provide the resource for. And then my chair roles were the same. And it just wouldn't work without that goodwill, but the passion as well. And in a way, it drives results, though, as well, because the people who are there aren't there because I'm being paid to sit on this committee. They're there because they love
and it's the outcome. The outcome is the important thing. So, cheers to you lot. Good on you.
They're an amazing bunch of...
Yeah, I certainly appreciate it. I just get to sit here on my ass and talk to people about it. I really wish, I just wish we could find an easier way to communicate to the public that most of the conservation work that goes on is unpaid volunteer work, because even though people are Dr. such and such or Professor such and such, most of the conservation work is work they do extra to what they're paid to, and that's where the volunteer stuff comes in. It's just like being the footy coach of the under-11s.
Yep. Well, certainly the lack of understanding of most people in terms of how even the scientific community works and funds itself, it boggles my mind. Like, more people should understand what it's like to write a grant, to pay your way and so on, and it's something which none of the organisations working in this space are exempt from. We all have to go through this, but right. It's there for a reason, and for whatever reason it is, that's the system we have, so we work within it. But I wish more people understood it.
Can I pull you up there, Chad, too? Because I feel a little bit like we've all been conditioned to this, to a great condition of swallowing bullshit, that we've all been conditioned to this. The competitive grants, they're all there for a reason. It's to stop waste and to make sure that the public money is used effectively. So that's at this end. And at the other end, we're pissing away billions of dollars into the hands of bloody billionaires. It's just, so we've been conditioned to accept that. Here's your deal, Chad. Now, here's your grant. Appreciate it and love me for giving it to you. That's just wrong, and that's because we do not value the wildlife and the habitat. It's all part of the process. We value the farm, but we don't value the timber that stands on it. And if we don't value that, we can't value the lizards or the insects.
To me, that whole thing as well, in essence, is a communications and marketing issue.
That's right.
And it really is.
That's
it
right.
really is. It's how do we...
And we're 70 years behind. We're probably 100 years behind in terms of that, because the value, the intrinsic value in Australian society to conquering the bush, carving out a livelihood from a harsh country, we're conditioned to that. The other way of looking at it is that we continue to stuff it up. We continue to bugger up the place we live, and we continue to kill the animals and the plants and the birds that rely on that patch of... One day, hopefully it's in this next decade or two, we turn that around and we start to value the land as well as...
Certainly one thing I'm very fortunate, I guess, for is the fact that I get to work in a space where I'm surrounded by the people who are passionate about it. Certainly my view of it, I get to see the people you referenced, the people who don't get paid, the people who are doing it off their own backs. I get to see that drive and energy and passion that's out there, which is why I'm very much an optimist on the conservation front. Like I certainly, there are very few conservation battles, I think, on the planet where an animal is still around where we've lost the battle. To me, there is always going to be an out, and it's just a question of finding the way.
That's right. We've got the skills, if we don't have the knowledge, we have the ability to gain the knowledge. We've got the ability to understand the relationships between species and within species. All that kind of knowledge we're able to get. It's just the commitment to making it happen. That's where the battle is still there.
Certainly, and it's also about how to make that. And it's certainly one of my biggest passions in my work. And
that's where we're going next.
Yeah. That was well timed of me, but it's about communicating that to the people who don't know that's happening. Because the vast majority of people still haven't heard of an orange-bellied parrot. And that's a concern for me. Yeah. How do we cross that bridge? I don't know. But it's that to me, that's why I'm so passionate about the public interaction side of the work that I do. Because the real win that we would get is the minute that, every single person just knows what they are. In the same way that koalas are a great example of this to me. Everyone knows koalas, they love koalas, and if you even talked about, and as has happened, if you talk about a future without koalas, it gets people on their feet, ready to get out there and do stuff.
It's a double-edged sword, though, because, where I'm coming from in Naarm or Melbourne, koalas, big-ticket item, greater glider, not so much. And the greater glider, we're knocking down their habitat every day, and that's to secure a couple of dozen jobs, which to me is Looney Tunes. But that's because no one is out there going, gee, greater gliders, we love them,
And that's certainly, that to me is almost the biggest conservation issue of
awareness.
The next 50 years. It's how do we make all the species. And the reality is, do we go through as a community and highlight each habitat that's under threat and find the one species in that habitat that we can get interest in that will protect it, which is a strategy that works? Or do we have to go back to the drawing board as a community and really get good communications, marketing, spokespeople, even to me, good writers, people who can tell a bloody good story, to get that interest and engagement involved, because to me, that's the crux of it, I think.
Well, I'm up to
because koalas have got a good story.
I'm up to about 85 interviews now that I would love someone to turn those into a story for the website so that it can get the SEO. Because, it's got nothing to do with me. It's just so much work for that kind of stuff to happen. But I remember when I interviewed Linda Bell, who is the General Manager of Saving Our Species in New South Wales. I think that strategy you identified about picking a habitat so that we have a habitat and an intact location that we can designate to protect, and that you then identify whether it be a waratah or a honeyeater or a cockatoo or a turtle or a whatever, a betong or an antechinus, whatever it is that is in the locality that you can make the movie star. That's the approach that may need to be taken, because there's not enough resources to tell the story of everyone. But people need to understand ecosystems, I think, better. So that's part of the challenge, isn't it? That we have to look. I don't know if the Web of Life was still the biology textbook when you were at high school, but that was what volume 1 and 2 of the Web of Life for year 11 and 12 biology. That's what we were being taught. The interconnectedness of everything. I don't know enough young people who are going through that process anymore to know whether education is still focusing on that, or whether we're teaching them to drive and about consent and respect and everything else, which is, it's all important. I just don't know whether the focus is still so there about the intrinsic connectedness of all life.
Certainly, when I went through school, and in the scheme of things, it wasn't that long ago. It feels like a long time ago sometimes, but it
was only yesterday. So
it was certainly still part of curriculum. I can't speak for now. I've got people on my team now who can vote, who were almost born after I started doing this job, which is terrifying. But it's just the reality of it. But they're still learning it. Is my understanding. I agree with you. I think the way we look at ecology, certainly, and how we communicate about it is important, but also then how we legislate and how we build policy framework around it too. Because if you're building policy framework around protecting, for example, just a breeding location, it doesn't then matter if you've got the breeding location down pat, if the summer feeding ground or whatever it isn't also protected. And so understanding, like OBP to me is a particularly complex program because of this, because we're crossing multiple jurisdictions, state jurisdictions. And so your policy frameworks differ. So how do you protect an animal where multiple departments and different states? And so we've got a framework that seems to work at the moment, but it's complex. It is because nature doesn't recognise state lines. And so or even government, even country lines. There are plenty of species which...
Well, let's not talk about seabirds or shorebirds then, will we?
Well, exactly. It's like, how do you even cross that bridge? Because then as well, how you vote as a person in your electorate here on your federal government might not even be the crux. It's really hard.
That's right.
I don't have the answer.
It might depend on Siberia or Korea or China or Taiwan or Thailand or that's right. Which is why we can't give up and we have to just keep saying these things. Now, I just want to butt in a bit and say the Facebook and the Twitch people, something you want to say or want me to ask or want Chad to respond to, stick it in the comments and let's go. Let's go back to talk more about you, Chad. Your live flight experience has taken you beyond Australia and you've done, as I mentioned earlier, over 35 individual shows in your time working as a keeper. Two things I want you to tell everyone is where have you worked or where have you gone to present shows? And then what do you think are the really important educational, interpretive, communication parts of those shows?
It's a great question, that second one. But in terms of my career, so I started at the Taronga Free Flight Show. So it was a goal of mine as a kid, as I spoke about earlier, to do that bird show. So I was very lucky because my industry is very competitive to get into. And the first job I happened to get was at the bird show that I actually wanted to present. It was like a career goal of me. Like I don't even think I realised how lucky I was at the time. Like now I look back on it and I look at people trying to get into my industry and I'm like, wow. And I worked hard and I volunteered, but also I was in the right place. I had the right mentors on my side. I had good people who wanted me to succeed as well. And I got to do that, which was amazing. So I was there for 12 months. Then I moved to Cairns in Far North Queensland and worked for a small family-run zoo, which is no longer there. It was called Cairns Tropical Zoo. It was in Palm Cove. So I got to live in Palm Cove for 3 years, which wasn't... And it was pretty relaxing, actually.
How the Botanic Gardens in Flecker? Fantastic place.
Stunning. And so I presented bird shows there. So we had a similar sort of species makeup of birds at the Cairns show. And then during that time, I got the opportunity to go over to the United States. And so while I was there, I was working for a company called Natural Encounters, Inc., which is run by a gentleman by the name of Steve Martin, not the comedian, another guy. He's also very funny, but not the comedian. And it's a bird show animal training company, basically. So their existence is they subcontract animal presentations or animal training consultancies to zoos overseas. And so I started at the bird show that's at the Disney Animal Kingdom, which is their zoo. We had a bird show there. And then we took a whole bunch of birds over to Dallas in Texas, and we set up a bird show at the Texas State Fair, which is like their version of our agricultural shows. Yeah. And we did in
every movie that's been set in the Midwest forever.
And it is as big as it was terrifyingly big. To put it in perspective, we were doing, and by the time I went there, I was there in the 25th year of Steve's company doing this bird show there. We had 90 birds, just under 20, and we were doing 5 to 6 shows a day with a amphitheatre that sat 5,000 people, and it was never an empty seat in the house across 3.5, 4 weeks.
So that's taking birds to so many people.
It is. It really is. That's why I love what I do. So following on from that, I did 3 years with marine mammals as well. So I did pinniped shows at Taronga working with sea lion and penguins before I came to Adelaide to do free flight again. But it's why I love it, because you are taking these animals to people who may not even be on the fence. The reality is the vast majority of people who go to a zoo, go to an aquarium, go to a state fair, whatever it is, are still going to just have a fun day out. That's the reality of it. That's what we know from the research. And so these people are going for a good day out. So they may not even be on your side already. They may not even be on the side of thinking even conservation is important. They're happy to go to the zoo, but they're doing it because they were taken to the zoo when they were a kid by their parents. It's what you do. So they're the people that we target and we've got to get on board, because they're the people really who are the missing link in this whole chain. It's the people who may not have even realised they have even the ability to do something about this stuff. And so for me, I look at my own experience where I told you earlier about the macaw. For me, it was that one moment, and here I am chairing a recovery team and, so on later, and it all stemmed from that moment. Sure, other things happened along the way, but the reality is we can do that exact same thing now for people. And I'm at the age now where there are people who have worked with me, who were kids who watched me do a show.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. How many disciples have you got on the team that have come through from that same experience in the amphitheatre?
Everyone who's works in a zoo has had a similar sort of experience, an interaction with an animal, or with a person and an animal, and generally there's a person and an animal involved. There's someone who's inspired you. And that to me is unbeatable. I look at these shows, and to me, and I use the word show, and I don't shy away from the word show, and I use the word entertainment, and I don't shy away from it either, because that's in reality what most people see it as. But I've got those people for 15 to 20 minutes. I have their undivided attention, and in that time, sure, they see a barking owl catch something in midair. They see a black-breasted buzzard crack open an emu egg.
That's something that I remember from that Taronga.
Yeah,
I wasn't sure. I couldn't be sure of my memory that it was a black-breasted buzzard, but yeah.
Yeah. You see that. You get an up-close experience with a macaw. So we fly macaws in our show. And during that time, if I can at least have them leave going, birds are cool, I'm happy. Yeah. Because they're then the person that the next time they see a story on the ABC about the bird that they were interested in that's a piece of research, it's on a piece of research or something, they'll stop and think and watch it. Or even just read that article that they see that pops across their feed or whatever. That to me is the key in what we do. And I understand there's ethical dilemmas about keeping animals in human care, and particularly around, I think, people looking at animal shows still as purely entertainment.
Can I just stop you there?
Yeah.
I wanted to note earlier on that I think this is a generational thing, that I've always been referring to the birds in captivity, and you're talking about the birds in human care. So I think that demonstrates a shift in the emphasis about where the animals are placed in the system. I don't think that our hearts or our heads are different, but that the time I grew up in, birds were in captivity. Now we are caring for animals in our care, which is elevating their position in the hierarchy, and that has got to be celebrated. But before we press the go button, we were talking a little bit about the ethics of the show, and I shared with you something that I'll share now. I'd been to the same Taronga show that you had about the same time, within the same handful of years, and I thought it was really well done. I really enjoyed it, and I couldn't see any problems. But I did go to one where I saw birds, which I thought I felt like they were trained pets rather than animals being appreciated, and certainly what they were being asked to do was pretty poor. And then I went to another one that was in Australia. Then I went to another one overseas that part of it was really good, but then they went back to the trained monkey aspect of a lot of the stuff with parrots doing corny things, riding bikes and all that kind of stuff. And I couldn't see any value that was educational and conservation focused in that part of the show. And that really got me thinking about the value of them. But I had an interaction with 2 hornbills, and the keepers at that park took me backstage. I got to see all the breeding aviaries, and they took me right through their labs and I got a really good look, and it was great. But these hornbills were sitting on me, and there was I can't remember which kind of crow it was, just macaws. It was phenomenal, the immersive value for me, and I was already a bird nerd, and that swung me back. And I thought, well, if you're getting kids in a country where they see birds as something where you raid their nests or you kill them because they're eating the crops or whatever, and that they then have a hands-on, a really tactile experience and in-your-face, eyeball-to-eyeball experience with birds that they can actually see as sentient animals, intelligent animals, that has value, that has intrinsic value in itself. So, how do you pick a bird that is a species or an individual that is suitable to be in a show like this, that is not being exploited? It's actually a sort of a willing partner in the whole activity. How do you do that?
It's a great question, and it's something that Steve Martin, the guy I was talking about earlier, actually did a great presentation on a few years ago at a conference, actually, in a paper called The Right Tool for the Job, which I think sums it up perfectly. There's a whole multitude of factors that comes down to, A, what facilities do you have to keep your animals? So, for example, if you don't have the facilities suitable to keep an eagle when you're not doing the show, you shouldn't have an eagle in your presentation. And if you want to have one
in your collection, you shouldn't have
one.
Well,
if you end up wanting to show that, for example, then you plan for appropriate facilities if you don't have it.
Yeah.
If you then have to look at your setup, so your space where you're flying the birds. Because as we know, bird flight is not bird flight. You can't get any bird to fly anywhere. There's a whole lot of factors that play into it. So, for example, at Taronga, beautiful amphitheatre, but because the trees were so close up behind you on the hill, it meant that if the wind was coming anywhere from the south, you had a reasonable kind of pocket of dead air around where the stage was. So you couldn't fly our peregrine falcons in the space when the wind was coming from any direction but the south. So they came out and flew when the wind was coming from the south. When the wind wasn't coming from the south, we used to take them off site every day to a park where they was higher up and they got good wind from all directions. So they'd still go out and fly. But that's a great example as well. If you've got wind pockets, for example, you can't then fly a bird that relies on consistent updrafts. So like for me, I feel uncomfortable with the idea of a pelican flying in a free flight show unless you've got a significant descent that the bird can make. So basically it's a controlled glide down to a stage, a takeoff to do the same thing going in reverse, because the physics of their flight is just completely different.
Yeah. Let's talk for a minute about a peregrine falcon. How does a peregrine falcon come into the collection and then possibly into the show? Are they birds that have been rescued or some, like they've come in through some misadventure, misfortune for the bird? They're not, people aren't captively breeding peregrines to go into bird shows, are they?
I don't think at the moment. So I wouldn't say 100% that it hasn't happened in Australia before, but certainly the peregrines that I know of and the peregrines that I've worked with were all kind of non-releasable.
For being bird strike or something, hit a car
exactly.
or something like that.
Exactly. And so for whatever reason, either the injury means that they can't physically function at full capacity in the wild, or they spent so much time in care that they became too reliant on people, and so they're not.
And that's a similar situation for most of the birds that will be in shows, isn't it? They're all.
I would say from most of the larger,
things like the and some of the cockatoos and whatnot are probably different, but a pelican will be one that's come in to to the zoo for some kind of veterinary work or something, and that then has not been able to be released and has a temperament that means they don't mind being.
So certainly that would be the case. So if you're getting a rehab animal in, so most, if not, I would say all but one of the wedge-tails currently flying in programs across Australia were wild rehabs. There was one that was part of a clutch that hatched at Flays back in the day, who I worked with that bird when he was in Cairns. So it has happened sporadically that a clutch will hatch in human care, and then they end up in a show. Generally, though, with those birds, it's a rehab case. But then as well, it's not any rehab is suitable. So you might have a bird that, for example, is completely missing a wing, or temperament-wise just isn't suitable. And certainly one thing we've got to be very careful with is the messaging around animals with injuries, keeping animals like that, how you keep them. But from a temperament perspective, you have to have the right kind of bird. You have to have a bird that doesn't look at, and it's not so much about how they look at people, because you can work on that. It's how they look. To me, what I look for is an animal that looks at change in stimuli and its environment and how they deal with it. So if you've got an animal that sees a change in stimuli in its environment and it looks at it and explores it and thinks about it, that's the bird that you want. If you've got a bird that sees something different and straight away goes, nah, I'm out of there, that's generally a bird that I would avoid personally, because the reality of working outdoors with these animals is I can't control what wild birds are going to fly over.
They're a flight risk, aren't they?
Exactly. And so you've got to be very picky about that stuff, yeah.
And obviously I make a joke about being a flight risk, but obviously if a bird from captivity does take fright and head off in the northeasterly direction, never to be seen again, the likelihood of it surviving is very low.
It's pretty slim, but one thing I will say on the fly-off topic, because it does happen, we've got your flying birds outside. Birds do occasionally take a wrong turn.
You've got your macaw from Adelaide. Was it the macaw that headed off for a holiday for a few days?
3 days. That was about 6 years ago now.
Yeah.
It happens. So what we do in that context is you do a lot of work with them, and a lot of people ask us how long it takes, and the reality is it depends on the bird, but before you go outside, you're not just training the routine that you see in the show. You train them flight skill. I'm training them how to descend. I'm training them how to land in a crosswind. I'm training them how to fly in rain. I'm training them how to fly with predators nearby, so alarm calls. I'm training them how to fly uphill. I'm training them how to go into their pet pack in every single different location that we need to, so that if they end up in someone's backyard, they'll walk into their pet pack in their driveway. So there's a lot of background work that happens. And then, what it means is when those occurrences do happen, because they do, you have an animal that can deal with lots of different weather conditions. So it's flight fit. And so it can handle being out. But also the minute it sees you, comes back to you, puts itself away. And because of that, like I've been flying birds. You said how many shows I've done, and I think about even just training sessions and individual birds, and I've never completely lost one. I've never had a bird that hasn't come back. We've always got them back, which is a pretty good stat when you think about the amount of flights that goes on.
Well, if you put the training and whatnot together, you must have done 10 or 15,000
probably
with individual birds. So to not having lost one in battle is a pretty good stat.
But yeah, you got to pick the right one. And to that as well, then there are species that then I would say that we do actively breed in human care if they're going to take part. So I would look at owls, for example. Owls are a great example.
Yeah, that's my next question. Who are you using now? And when I say using, who are in the show? Who are the best ones? And how do you can you tell with a young bird of a suitable species that has come into care by whichever method? Can you tell? Are you like the bird flight show whisperer?
I wouldn't go that far necessarily. I have a list of things that I like to see very quickly if I'm assessing a bird.
What are they?
So definitely the reacting to different stimuli is just number one. I want to see an animal that is interested by change. terrified of
Not
change.
terrified.
That's starting. I like an animal that's still physically fit, even if they've got some form of injury, because I just want to make sure that, because flying daily in show is still physical work. So we want to make sure that your animal's physically fit to be able to do it. That's what I look for. And you generally can see those things pretty quickly. We've got a team of people that are involved in the assessment process. So our vets, obviously, our creative programs and animal behaviour manager, my fellow senior keeper. There's a whole bunch of people that would look at these things. But for us at the moment, our program is 2 red-tailed black. So one is actually a southeastern. She's the first southeastern that we've actually had in care at the zoo many years. And she is missing a wing. So she was found on a property near Mount Gambier by a participant in that project, a landholder who found her, realised something was up and brought her down to the zoo. We had to amputate the wing, unfortunately. But she's an amazing ambassador, A, for that program, and B, for the work that occurs in the conservation space. So we've got her. We've got another red-tailed black that's in training. She was found in a driveway after a storm in Adelaide, so we think she got blown down to Adelaide from Mount Gambier. We've got a galah. So we tell the story of galahs and how they've adapted, but also how we see them around us all the time, and there's still a lot of things about them that we don't pay attention to.
Yeah.
So it's about, even though you see them all the time, pay attention. We then have a black-breasted buzzard that cracks open an emu egg, which is an instinctive behaviour for them. You never have to teach them how to do that. You show them an emu egg and they do it. So we make an emu egg out of plaster. And we've got a sooty owl, so a lesser owl by the name of Oscar, who I actually reared in Cairns for the show there, who's then been at Adelaide for the last 5 years. And a barking owl. So we've got a barking owl called Albert Einstein, and great name. And then a blue and gold macaw. And then in training, we've got a black-necked stork, so a juvenile black-necked stork, which is going to be amazing, that species.
Yeah, come and see that.
He's amazing. His name's Karumba, after the small town up on the Gulf of Carpentaria, which was the first place I ever saw wild jabiru, and I am obsessed with this bird. He's amazing.
And for those who don't know, the jabiru is the old name for the black-necked stork.
Correct. And so I love me a black-necked stork. And when he makes it into show, he'll be only the third one in a show in the whole planet. So we're very excited about him. We've got a flock of African grey parrots, which we're training, and 2 Cape parrots. So we've got a pretty decent team of birds. We don't have a huge amount of spaces dedicated to free flight, so we have to be very picky. Yeah, because we don't have spaces coming out the wazoo to dedicate to it. So we're very selective of the birds that we have and then the role that they have. So it's a cool process. I love it. And we get to give people this amazing taste of bird life, just enough to get them interested, show them some cool behaviours, give them that immersive experience. Because the reality is, when you do the research, people in a zoo spend on average 2 minutes standing in front of an aviary, but they spend 15 to 20 minutes at a bird show. So I've got just that much more time.
And half an hour in the line at the cafe.
Exactly. And so our messaging never stops. You go to our zoos and we've got conservation messaging there. Because it's the reality, and we've got to get people where we can. So
I haven't been to Adelaide Zoo for 15 years or so, and I'm really looking forward to coming again, because 15 years ago I didn't think that Adelaide Zoo was a patch on Melbourne, but I'm guessing now that, and that was from the point of view of the messaging, the interpretive signage, the displays and whatnot, and I'm guessing it's a million times improved over that time.
We work hard. We work very hard as a group of people, and we've got an amazing leadership team, but we've also got an amazing team of people across the organisation, volunteers who have made our 2 zoos really beautiful places to visit. And I've worked in many places, and it genuinely is, and I'm hand on heart, I'm not saying it because I currently work there, it is genuinely my favourite place that I've ever worked. It's we talk the talk, but also as an organisation, it's really nice to see an organisation that genuinely walks the walk as well, particularly when we just don't have many resources, but we'll still the last 2 years from COVID has been a real pressure on us financially, but never once did we scale back a financial commitment to a recovery program, a breeding program, ever. It just wasn't ever on the cards. We scaled back other things, but that was never, ever a question, which is great to see.
Yeah, that shows real commitment. Last chance, for those watching, to pose a question, because we're running up to time. We've actually only got a limit because the stream will shut off, I think. We probably... Look, I would love to talk more about the ins and outs of the breeding programs if that gets ticked off at some stage. I know people would be really interested in talking more about Regents and the Plains Wanderers. I know you're not the lead on the Plains Wanderer in particular, but that's like the kookiest bird. So that would be a fun thing to do. Yeah. So, Chad, I hope you felt like you told us everything we need to know. The last thing I guess it's important for people to know is if they want to come to one of the free flight shows at Adelaide, do they have to book?
No, so that's just part of your general admission. So if you walk in the gate, you can come in, and we're no longer requiring, we're back to just, you can buy your ticket at the gate now. So you can, I would still probably advise people to pre-book, only because it makes your entry process faster, but you don't have to. You can just rock up on the day, buy a ticket and come on in, and it's part of the daily programming. So there's lots and lots to see and do.
And on average, I'm guessing you've got a pretty set timetable. How many shows a day you're doing, and what's the earliest one?
So currently we're doing one free flight a day at Adelaide. So we do an 11:30 free flight in the morning, 11:30 in the morning. And then we'll do, when we do the summer zoo in the summer holidays where we're open into the evening, we do a second free flight in the evening. So for that program. But also we do, during the day, we do a feed and meet the keeper at our Southeast Asian walkthrough aviary. So you can come and meet the keeper there at 10:45. And we feed, we've got lorries, so Southeast Asian lorries, Nicobar pigeons, all sorts of cool stuff there. And then in the afternoon, we do an Australian rainforest and wetlands and meet the keeper and feed. So you can go into our rainforest and see our lyrebird and stuff like that. So there's lots of bird nerd stuff to do, as well as, because we've got penguins and pelicans too on that list. So there's...
Well, I'll get Chad to give me the current info. I'll put it on the appropriate page, which will be birdemergency.com/Chad. We've got to do this, Chad. We've got to say thanks, Chad Crittle, Adelaide Zoo, Zoos SA, for being on the Bird Emergency. I'm Grant Williams. Thanks for watching. I feel like I'm on TV now. Thanks for watching, and look forward to doing it again very soon. Thanks, Chad.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Been a pleasure.